The map landed on Stephen Barker's desk like a thunderclap in a clear sky. He had been staring at nothing for the better part of an hour, his coffee gone cold, the stack of wanted posters beside him as useless as last winter's snow. 7 months. 7 months since the Aldridge gang had burned through Copper Falls, New Mexico, leaving 4 men dead, and a fortune in stolen silver vanished into the desert like smoke. 7 months since Marshal Stephen Barker had followed every lead, chased every rumor, and ridden every trail into dead ends and dried creek beds. The territorial governor was losing patience. The mining company was losing money. And Stephen Barker was losing his mind. Then the door to his office opened and Mamie Alden walked in. She was not what he expected. He had been told she was a widow, recently arrived from Santa Fe, that her late husband had been one of the 4 men killed in the Aldridge raid. He had expected grief. He had expected tears, perhaps, or the brittle composure of a woman holding herself together by sheer will. He had not expected the way she moved, like someone who had already decided exactly what she was going to do and was simply following through on a plan she had laid days ago. He had not expected the calm in her dark eyes, the kind of calm that comes not from peace but from purpose. And he had not expected the rolled piece of leather she set on his desk, unrolling it with steady hands to reveal something that stopped the breath in his chest. It was a map, but not just any map. It was the most precise, most detailed, most damning document Stephen Barker had ever seen in his 12 years as a lawman. Every campsite the Aldridge gang had used since the raid was marked in careful ink. Every relay point where they swapped horses. Every safe house and hidden canyon and dry riverbed they used to move the silver. The route they had taken out of Copper Falls, the one he had lost 3 weeks after the raid, was drawn in fine, unwavering lines across the New Mexico territory like a confession. He looked up at her. She met his gaze without flinching. "I have been tracking them," she said simply, "for 5 months." The words hit him like a fist. He stood up slowly as if sudden movement might shatter the moment. "You have been," he repeated carefully, "tracking the Aldridge gang." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." Stephen Barker was not a man who lost his composure easily. He had faced down outlaws in Dodge City. He had ridden into Apache territory under a white flag and ridden out again with a treaty. He had pulled men from burning buildings and dragged outlaws from flooded rivers. But standing in his own office, looking at a map drawn by a woman he had met 45 seconds ago, a map that made every piece of intelligence his entire office had gathered look like the scribbles of a schoolchild, he felt something crack open inside him that he could not quite name. He looked back at the map, then back at her. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. Mamie Alden straightened. Not with arrogance, with the quiet dignity of someone who has earned every inch of the space they stand in. "I am the woman who is going to help you bring them in," she said. "If you will stop being surprised long enough to listen." He listened. 6 weeks earlier, Mamie Alden had stood at the grave of her husband, Thomas Alden, in the small windswept cemetery on the edge of Copper Falls. Thomas had been a surveyor, hired by the Consolidated Silver Mining Company to assess the value of a new claim in the hills north of town. He had been standing outside the company offices when the Aldridge gang rode in on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1883, and he had been shot not because he posed any threat, but because he had looked up at the wrong moment and one of Cole Aldridge's men, a trigger-happy fool named Dex Prout, had panicked. Thomas Alden had been 31 years old. They had been married 4 years. They had no children, a fact that Mamie had spent the last year quietly grieving before the larger grief of his death swallowed everything else. She had come to New Mexico from Virginia 6 years ago, following Thomas, who had followed the survey work west. She had built a life here from scratch, and now that life had a hole in it the size of a canyon, and the men who had made the hole were still riding free somewhere in the desert. Marshal Barker's office had sent her a written notification of Thomas's death, a form letter with his name filled in by hand. She had read it twice, folded it precisely, and set it on the kitchen table. Then she had gone to her surveying equipment, because Mamie Alden was a surveyor too, not a widow of a surveyor, not someone who had learned a little from watching her husband. She had trained formally in Richmond, Virginia, at a time when women in the profession were rare enough to be remarkable, under a father who believed that a sharp mind was a sharp mind regardless of the body it lived in. She had a surveyor's eye and a surveyor's patience, and a surveyor's understanding of terrain that went bone deep. When Thomas had gotten the New Mexico contract, she had worked alongside him, and the survey maps that had impressed the mining company bore as much of her hand as his. So when she decided to find the men who had killed her husband, she did not do it with a gun or with rage. She did it with what she knew best. She read the land. She started from the site of the raid in Copper Falls, and she worked outward in expanding arcs, the way a surveyor triangulates from known points. She knew from talking to the surviving witnesses which direction the gang had ridden out. She knew from the company ledgers that the stolen silver amounted to 43 crates, each weighing roughly 60 pounds. That weight meant wagon wheels, and wagon wheels meant specific types of trails. Not every canyon in New Mexico could accommodate a loaded wagon. She eliminated 2/3 of the possible routes within the first week simply by understanding what the terrain would and would not allow. She rode out alone every day at dawn and returned at dusk, sometimes covering 20 miles, sometimes 5. She carried her transit and her chain and her notebook, and every observation she made went into that notebook in precise, careful notation. She found the first campsite 3 weeks out from the raid, in a shallow bowl behind a red rock formation 12 miles southeast of town. The fire ring was cold and scattered, but she measured the spacing of the debris, the depth of the ash, and the indentations left by the wagon wheels in the caliche soil, and she wrote it all down. She found the second site 2 weeks after that. Then the third. She was building a picture of how the gang moved, how far they traveled between rest points, how they timed their movements to avoid the marshal's patrols. Because she could read the land, she could read their habits in the land. Where they camped told her how they thought. The evasion routes they chose told her what they feared. The way they concealed their wagon tracks told her they had someone among them who understood terrain, which meant they had a guide, and a guide meant a predictable methodology. By the end of May, she had mapped 5 separate campsites. By the end of June, she had traced their route all the way to a series of abandoned mine shafts in the Sangre de Cristo foothills. She had not gone inside those shafts. She was not reckless. But she had measured the fresh wheel ruts at the entrance and the boot prints in the mud after a recent rain, and she knew the silver was there, and she knew the gang was coming back for it. That was when she had walked into Marshal Stephen Barker's office and unrolled her map. Stephen Barker stared at the map for a long time after she finished explaining. She had spoken for nearly 20 minutes without pause, clear and organized as a courtroom attorney, and he had not interrupted her once, which was unusual for him. He was a man who asked questions. He was a man who challenged and probed and pushed back on information until he was satisfied it was solid. But she answered every question before he could ask it. When she talked about the terrain analysis, she used words he recognized from conversations with professional surveyors hired by the territory, and she used them with authority. "These 2 sites," he said finally, pointing to a pair of marked locations in the foothills. "Our men rode through that area in April. They found nothing. They were looking for tracks on the main trail," Mamie said. "The gang was using the secondary drainage on the east side of the ridge. In April, the runoff from the snowmelt would have erased most of the sign, but the cut banks along the drainage still held the impression of wagon wheels. They were moving at night." He looked at her. "How do you know they were moving at night?" "Because the wheel impressions are on the western slope of every rise," she said. "When a wagon moves in daylight in summer in this territory, the driver keeps to the shade when possible. West-facing slopes are shaded in the morning. The gang was traveling in the hours just before dawn, arriving at each campsite before full sunrise. The compaction pattern in the soil confirms it. The ground holds moisture differently at night, and the impressions are deeper and more defined than they would be if the soil had been baked dry before the wheels passed over. The silence in the office was absolute. Stephen Barker had been doing this work for 12 years. He had 2 deputies who had been with him for 5 years each. He had used 2 different sets of professional trackers on the Aldridge case. None of them had told him anything that matched the precision of what this woman had just described in the last 20 minutes. He pulled his chair back and sat down. She remained standing. She had not been invited to sit, and she was not the kind of woman who needed the invitation. "The mine shafts," he said. "You are certain?" "I measured 14 separate sets of boot prints around the entrance to the primary shaft over a period of 3 visits across 8 days. The gang has been returning to the site on a rotating basis, likely to move portions of the silver in smaller loads, which suggests they have a buyer for it in pieces. If I had to estimate, based on the frequency of the visits and the depth change in the wheel ruts at the entrance, they have already moved approximately a third of the original 43 crates." Stephen pushed back from the desk and stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, Copper Falls went about its afternoon business in the bright June heat, wagons rolling past, horses tied to hitching posts, a woman in a blue dress crossing the street carrying a basket. He turned back to Mamie Alden. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." She lifted her chin slightly. "I have been honest." "I know," he said. "That is not what I am questioning. What I am asking is this. You have been doing this work for 5 months. You have been riding out alone into territory where the Aldridge gang is actively operating. You have been close enough to their campsites to measure boot prints. Do they know about you?" A pause, the first one she had taken. "I do not believe so," she said. "I have been careful. That is not the same as no." "No," she agreed quietly. "It is not the same as no." Stephen looked at the map again. The mine shafts were marked with a small cross. They were in the foothills, 2 days' ride from Copper Falls. If the gang had any sense that someone had been following their trail, if they had spotted her even once, they could be watching those shafts right now and waiting. "You said they are moving the silver in pieces," he said. "When do you estimate the next transfer?" "Based on the interval between the visits I documented, I would expect them to return to the shafts within the next 4 to 6 days. 4 to 6 days. "I cannot mount a full posse in that window without word getting around town," he said, thinking aloud. "Aldridge has informants here, at least one, possibly more. Every time I have moved in strength, they have been 3 days ahead of me." "I know," Mamie said. He looked at her sharply. "You know about the informant." "I have a strong suspicion about who it is," she said. "Based on who was in the telegraph office on the 3 occasions when your movements were compromised. I cannot prove it, but if you want my assessment, tell me." "Floyd Haggart, the freight dispatcher." Stephen went very still. Floyd Haggart had been in Copper Falls for 3 years. He was unremarkable and mild-mannered, and the kind of man nobody ever looked at twice. He had access to the freight schedules, which meant he knew when shipments of silver were going out and when the marshal's office was occupied with other business. "What makes you think it is Haggart?" "He was in the telegraph office on April 3rd when your deputies rode north and the gang crossed south. He was there on May 17th when you sent for territorial reinforcements, and on June 2nd when your tracker rode out toward the foothills." She paused. "I noticed him because he never sends telegrams himself. He is always there when someone else is." The crack inside Stephen Barker's chest opened a little wider. He had been doing this work for 12 years, and a widow who had set herself to surveying outlaw trails in her grief had just handed him his informant, his route map, his campsite locations, and a 4 to 6 day window, all in less than half an hour. He pulled out the chair across from his desk and held it out. "Please sit down, Mrs. Alden," he said. "I think we need to talk about what happens next." Mamie sat down. And for the first time since she had walked into his office, the smallest flicker of something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it moved across her face. She was not done with her grief. She was not done with the cold anger that had driven her out into the desert every morning for 5 months. But there was something different about carrying a burden when someone else finally acknowledged how heavy it was. She had expected the marshal to dismiss her. She had prepared herself for it. She had rehearsed arguments in her hotel room for 3 nights before coming to see him. She had not prepared herself for the way he had listened, really listened, without the condescension she had braced for. He was watching her now with a directness that was not rude but was thorough, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand rather than something he is trying to categorize. "How old are you, Mrs. Alden?" he asked. 29, she said, "and you can call me Mamie." "Stephen," he said. He did not say it like an introduction, he said it like a decision. She noticed that he was younger than she had initially thought. When she had walked in, the badge and the weariness had made him seem older, but now, sitting across from her in the afternoon light, she could see that he was probably in his middle 30s, not far past 30 perhaps. His face was weathered but not worn out. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes the color of strong coffee, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut out of the same red rock she had been measuring for the past 5 months. He spread the map flat on the desk between them and put 2 coffee mugs on the corners to hold it open. "If we go in small," he said, "2 or 3 men, using your route, coming in from the east drainage the way the gang does, we can approach the shafts without being seen from the main trail." "Yes," she said. "But you need to time it right. The gang uses a lookout on the ridge above the shafts. I spotted him twice, always positioned before noon. So we go in before dawn." "Yes. And you need to account for the fact that there are likely 2 exits from the shaft complex. There is the primary entrance at the base, but based on the ventilation patterns in the old survey maps for that area, there should be a secondary shaft approximately 300 feet to the northeast. I cannot verify it from the outside, but the original mining company filed the plans with the territory in 1879, and I sent for the copies." She reached into the leather satchel she had carried in and set a folded document on the table beside the map. He unfolded it. It was a hand-traced copy of the original mine survey with notations in her precise, small handwriting marking the locations of the ventilation shafts and the estimated depth of each tunnel. Stephen Barker stared at it. Then he laughed, a sudden unguarded sound that surprised them both. "You sent for the mine survey," he said. 3 weeks ago," she said. "I wanted to be thorough." He shook his head slowly, not with exasperation, with something close to wonder. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the windows going gold and then orange and then dark while they planned. Stephen sent his deputy, a quiet, reliable man named Cord Faber, to keep quiet watch on Floyd Haggart, with strict instructions not to approach or tip the man off, simply to document his movements and to make sure no telegrams went out from the office in the next 4 days. The other deputy, a younger man named Pete Rawls, was sent home with a fabricated errand in the opposite direction from the foothills, a deliberate misdirection in case any word leaked. Stephen and Mamie would ride out in 3 days, ahead of the window she had predicted, to stake out the mine complex before the gang returned. They would be joined by one other man, a former Army scout named Gus Hartley who Stephen trusted completely and who could read terrain nearly as well as Mamie could. "Nearly," Stephen said when he told her about Hartley, and there was something in the way he said it that made her look at him carefully, as if she was trying to determine whether he was teasing her. He was, just slightly, but there was something in the teasing that was entirely respectful, the way one professional acknowledges another. She returned to her hotel that night and sat in the chair by the window for a long time before she lit the lamp. The map was gone, now in Stephen Barker's possession, but she had the whole of it memorized anyway. Every line, every notation, every campsite and drainage and ridge. She had spent 5 months building it inside her head before she ever put it to leather, and it was as much a part of her now as her own heartbeat. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the way he had laughed, big and generous, a laugh that filled whatever room he was in. She thought about the fact that she had come here today to do the thing she had promised herself she would do for him, and it was done, Or the first part of it was. The second part would happen in the foothills in 3 days. She did not think very much about Marshal Stephen Barker. She told herself she did not. She was not quite successful. 3 days later, Mamie Alden, Stephen Barker, and Gus Hartley rode out of Copper Falls in the gray hour before dawn, heading southeast along a route that would bring them around to the east drainage of the Sangre de Cristo foothills by the following evening. They traveled light and they traveled quiet, with enough provisions for a week, and a plan that Mamie had been refining in her head for 2 solid nights. Gus Hartley was a compact, weather-seamed man in his mid-40s who had spent 15 years with the Army in the Southwest before transitioning to scouting work for the Marshal's office. He had said exactly 4 words to Mamie when they were introduced, which was "Pleasure, ma'am." And then he had looked at the additional route notes she had prepared and said nothing for a full minute before saying to Stephen, "She is right about the drainage approach," which, from Gus Hartley, Mamie understood was high praise. They made camp the first night in a shallow ravine far enough off the trail to be invisible. The fire was small and short-lived, burned down before full dark. They ate cold biscuits and dried beef in the dark afterward, and the desert sky above them was enormous and absolutely blazing with stars. Stephen sat across the dead fire from Mamie, close enough that she could see his face in the starlight. Gus had rolled into his bedroll with the efficiency of a man who slept when he could because he had learned that sleep was a resource, not a pleasure. "Tell me about your training," Stephen said quietly. The question surprised her a little. Not its directness. She had gathered that he was a direct man, but its specificity. He was not asking about Thomas. He was not asking how she had come to be in New Mexico. He was asking about her. "My father was a surveyor in Virginia," she said. "He believed that understanding land was the most fundamental thing a person could do. He taught me from the time I could walk with him through the fields. I had formal training by the time I was 17. Women were allowed in the training program." "No," she said simply. "I attended as his apprentice. Some of the instructors objected. He overruled them." Stephen was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a formidable man." "He was," she said. "He died 4 years ago, shortly after I came west. I am sorry." "Thank you." She looked at the stars. "He would have been very interested in New Mexico. The territory has a geological complexity that Virginia does not match. The way the land folds here, the way the water has cut through rock over 10,000 years, it is extraordinary to read." Stephen tilted his head. "Read." "To a surveyor the land is a text," she said. "You learn to read it. Every slope has a story. Every erosion pattern tells you something about time and water and pressure. Most people see terrain. I see history." He was quiet again. She had the impression of a man who was listening all the way through, who was not waiting for a pause in which to say his own thing, but was actually taking in what she said and turning it over. "Is that what you were doing for 5 months?" he asked. "Reading the land for the story the gang left in it?" "Yes," she said, "exactly that. I have been a marshal for 12 years, he said. "I have worked with trackers and scouts and former military men. I have never had anyone describe what they do the way you just did." She looked at him. "Most people who read land do not think to describe it that way. They just do it. But you know why you can do it." "Knowing why you can do something and knowing how to do it are different skills," she said. "I have always preferred to know both." He smiled. She could see it even in the starlight, a slow, genuine thing that changed the whole line of his face. She looked away at the stars. The second day of riding took them through country that grew increasingly dramatic, red and ochre and ancient, the Sangre de Cristo foothills building on the horizon through the afternoon heat. Mamie rode beside Stephen for much of the day, with Gus ranging ahead to check for sign. The conversation that came between them was not the kind that either of them had planned. It arrived in pieces, between long, comfortable silences, which Mamie found unusual because silences with strangers were generally not comfortable, but this one was. He told her a little about his early life. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith, and had come west at 20 following work and ended up in law enforcement almost by accident. He said he had intended to stay in law enforcement for 5 years and had somehow been doing it for 12, which seemed to have surprised him about himself. She told him that when she had first come to New Mexico, she had found the scale of it disorienting. In Virginia, the world had edges. Here the sky went on until you were not sure the earth was real. Did it stop being disorienting? He asked. It became something else, she said, something closer to belonging. He looked at her with that thoroughness again. She was beginning to understand that look was not evaluation. It was attention. He paid complete attention to the people he talked to, which was, she thought, a rare and somewhat alarming quality. By the late afternoon of the second day, they had come around into the east drainage, exactly as the map described. Mamie led them through the dry creek bed, reading the land as she went, pointing out the subtle signs she had catalogued on her earlier visits. The graze mark on a rock where a wagon wheel had clipped it, the disturbed caliche where a horse had shied and been steadied, the particular way the brush on one bank was thinner than the other where someone had repeatedly pushed through. Gus Hartley moved up alongside her and watched her work for 20 minutes without saying anything. Then he said to Stephen quietly, "She does not miss a thing." "I know," Stephen said. Mamie heard them both and said nothing, but she felt something warm and involuntary move through her chest that she immediately set aside because now was not the time for any of that. They set up their observation position on the eastern ridge above the mine shafts just before sunset, concealed in a series of natural rock formations that gave them a clear sight line down to the primary entrance. The secondary shaft was visible about 300 feet to the northeast, exactly where Mamie's copy of the 1879 survey had indicated. The entrance was partially collapsed but not fully blocked. They settled in to wait. The first night at the observation point was cold. The desert cold was a specific, penetrating kind that Mamie had learned to respect and prepare for, and she had her heavy wool coat and a thick blanket in her roll. She and Stephen took turns on watch, 2 hours each, while Gus slept, and then Gus took the early morning watch while they both rested. In the second watch rotation, around 2 in the morning when the cold was at its deepest and the stars were burning holes in the black sky, Stephen sat beside her on the flat rock that served as their observation point, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, and she did not move away, and he did not move away, and they watched the dark mouth of the mine shaft below in silence. "Are you frightened?" he asked, very quietly. The question was not patronizing. She could hear in it that he was asking because he genuinely wanted to know, not because he was checking whether she was going to fall apart. "A little," she admitted. "I have been out here for 5 months and I have always been alone. This feels different, having people here." "Different bad or different good," she considered. "Both, I think. When I was alone, I only had to manage my own fear. Now I have something to lose." She felt him look at her. "Meaning us," he said. "Meaning you and Gus," she said, and was glad the darkness hid her face because she was fairly certain the words had come out in the wrong order, or at least in an order that revealed something she had not intended to reveal. He did not push it. He simply nodded and looked back at the mine shaft, and the silence between them was that same comfortable, impossible thing it had been since the first night. The gang arrived on the morning of the third day. They came exactly as Mamie had predicted, before dawn, approaching from the western trail and reaching the primary shaft in the gray light just before sunrise. There were 8 of them, which was more than Stephen and Gus had hoped for, but Mamie had suggested the larger number when she had estimated the load size, and she had been right. A partial transfer of the silver, perhaps 12 to 15 crates, required significant manpower to move quickly. Cole Aldrich himself was among them, a lean, narrow-shouldered man in his 50s who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been doing criminal things for a long time and had survived by never being careless. Beside him was Dex Prout, the man who had shot Thomas, and seeing him, Mamie felt the cold anger in her chest compressed to a hard, specific point. She did not act on it. She had not come out here for vengeance. She had come to end this, and ending it meant doing this exactly right. Stephen had already planned for the contingency of a larger group. They had agreed that if the numbers were beyond what he and Gus could handle directly, they would let the gang begin loading the silver and then signal. The signal was a mirror flash to the ridgeline where Pete Rawls had been repositioned 2 days ago, unknown to Floyd Haggart, with 4 additional territorial deputies who had been brought in discreetly, without telegrams, without freight dispatches, without any channel that Haggart could monitor. Mamie held the mirror. She watched the angles of the light, calculating the sun's position as it cleared the eastern ridge, working out the geometry of the reflection in her head. When the moment was right, when the sun was at precisely the angle she needed, she used the mirror and sent the signal, 3 long flashes and 2 short, and then waited. Stephen's hand was on her shoulder during the flash, a light, steady pressure, and she was not sure if it was meant to be reassuring or if it was simply the natural reflex of a man keeping contact with a partner in a tense moment, but she was grateful for it either way. 18 minutes later, Pete Rawls and the 4 deputies came over the western ridge in a pincer move that Stephen had designed based on Mamie's map, using the terrain exactly as she had laid it out, cutting off the gang's route to their horses, boxing them against the rock face of the foothills with the primary shaft behind them and no exit to either side. The secondary shaft was covered by Gus Hartley, positioned at its entrance with his rifle, so there was nowhere to go. It was not entirely clean. There was a period of about 8 minutes that was very loud and very frightening, during which Mamie pressed herself flat against the rock and kept her eyes open, because she had decided weeks ago that she would not close her eyes to the consequences of what she had set in motion. 2 of the gang members tried to run north along the base of the cliff and were cut off. One man fired 3 shots at Pete Rawls and missed all 3 before Cord Faber, who had ridden out to join them at the last moment with Haggart in custody, disarmed him. Cole Aldridge did not run. He stood at the mouth of the primary shaft with his hands at his sides and looked at the circle of armed men closing in on him, and then he looked up at the ridge where Stephen Barker was standing, and he called out in a voice that was almost conversational, "Somebody talked." "Nobody talked," Stephen called back. "Somebody read the land." Aldridge looked around at the ridgeline and the drainage and the sealed secondary shaft and the deputies coming in from 3 directions simultaneously, and Mamie could see him doing the math, working out how the approach could have been this perfectly coordinated, and then his narrow eyes settled on the eastern ridge and she knew he had seen her, a woman in a brown coat standing on the rock with a signal mirror. He said nothing else. He put his hands up. Dex Prout tried to run. He was the last to come out of the shaft and he bolted south, which was the one direction that had looked open from the inside of the shaft entrance. But Mamie had known it was not open. She had mapped the terrain. She had told Stephen that a man running south from the primary entrance would hit a rock drop of approximately 15 feet within 30 yards. It was not survivable at speed. She had not wanted him to die exactly, but she had needed him to be stopped. Gus Hartley intercepted Prout before he reached the drop, bringing him down hard and professionally at the edge of the rocks, and the sound of the arrest, the shout and the scuffle and the metallic click of irons, echoed off the cliff face in the morning air. It was over in less than an hour from the first signal flash. All 8 members of the Aldridge gang were in irons. The silver was still in the shaft, 31 of the original 43 crates, and the other 12 had been moved to a warehouse in a town 30 miles north, which Aldridge gave up with surprising readiness, once it became clear that his situation was absolutely without recourse. Floyd Haggart was in custody in Copper Falls, brought in quietly by Cord Faber in the early hours of that same morning. Mamie Alden stood in the mouth of the mine shaft and looked at the crates of silver in the dim interior, stacked carefully in the darkness, and she felt something inside her shift and settle, like a plate of land after an earthquake finds its final position. Thomas was still gone. Nothing changed that, But this thing she had promised herself she would do, this 5 months of grief and determination and riding out alone into the desert every morning, it had been completed. The men who had taken him from her were going to face the law's justice. The silver that had indirectly cost him his life was recovered. And she had done it, not because someone had done it for her, not because a marshal had swept in and solved it, but because she had applied the only tools she had, her mind and her training and her knowledge of the land, and they had been enough. More than enough. Stephen came to stand beside her in the mouth of the shaft. He looked at the crates of silver. Then he looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about giving a composed answer. She was good at composed answers. She had been giving them for 5 months to people who asked how she was doing in the careful tone people use when they expect grief. "I will be," she said instead. He nodded. That was all. He did not offer anything further, not platitudes, not reassurances, not the ambient social pressure to be doing better than she was. Just a nod that said he had heard her, and it was enough. They rode back to Copper Falls over 2 days, arriving on a Thursday afternoon to find that the news had somehow already preceded them, the way news always did in small western towns, and there were people on the street who stopped to watch as the Aldridge gang was brought in chain to their saddles. There were not very many people, because Copper Falls was not a large town, but the ones who were there were very quiet, and Mamie found that their silence was more affecting than cheering would have been. The territorial governor sent his representative within the week. The mining company sent a letter, and then a man, and then, eventually, a significantly generous settlement offered to the families of the men killed in the raid. Mamie's lawyer in Santa Fe handled the negotiations, because Mamie Alden was not naive about money, and she was not naive about settlements, and she knew that the first offer was never the correct offer. She stayed in Copper Falls. She was not entirely sure why at first. She had a room at the hotel and a surveying commission that the territorial government had offered her based on, she suspected, Stephen Barker's recommendation to help accurately map the disputed land boundaries in the Copper Falls district that had been the source of ongoing legal conflict between the mining company and the local ranchers. It was good work. It was the kind of work she was exceptionally suited for, and it kept her out in the land every day, which was where she was most herself. She saw Stephen Barker almost every day, not always for reasons connected to the case or the commission, though in the early weeks there were plenty of those, depositions to give, maps to submit to the territorial court, questions about the mine survey and the evidence and the chain of events that she needed to answer carefully and officially. But after those were done, there were other reasons. He had taken to stopping by the hotel in the late afternoon, when her day in the field was done and before dinner, and they would sit on the porch of the hotel in the last of the afternoon sun and talk. She told him about Virginia. He told her about Missouri. She told him about her father, about the precise, illuminated way the old man had seen the world. He told her about the cases that had stayed with him over 12 years, the ones that had kept him lying awake, and the ones that had made him feel like the work was right. He talked about justice with the same respect she gave to the land, as a living thing, complex and difficult and worth the effort. It was early August when she realized she was in love with him, and the realization came the way geological shifts come, not as a sudden event, but as the point at which the accumulated pressure of many smaller events becomes undeniable. She was mapping a particularly complex section of the northeast ridgeline when it hit her, standing in the full heat of the noon sun with her transit on its tripod and her notebook in her hand. And she thought, oh, and then she thought, this is inconvenient. And then she folded the notebook, finished her measurements with her usual precision, and rode back to town. He was sitting on the porch of the hotel when she arrived, which he was not supposed to be, because it was the middle of a workday and he had a marshal's office to run. She tied her horse at the rail and looked at him. "You are not at your office," she said. "It is Thursday," he said, as if that explained something. She climbed the 2 steps to the porch and sat in the chair beside him, which was her chair now, unspoken, simply understood. "What happens on Thursdays?" "The Aldridge trial date was set today," he said. "September 14th, you will need to testify." "I know," she said. "I expected that. The territorial attorney wants to submit your map and your field notes as evidence." "They are welcome to them." She looked at the street, 2 horses, a dog asleep in the shade, a child running from one side to the other for no apparent reason. He said the testimony of the person who created the map will carry more weight than the map itself. "He is right," Stephen said. "You will do well." "How do you know?" He looked at her. "That thorough, complete attention." "Because I have watched you explain your work to 3 different attorneys, 2 territorial judges, and a mining company executive, and every single time, by the end of the conversation, the other person in it understands exactly what you want them to understand. You have the clearest mind of anyone I have ever met." The words landed very quietly and very squarely in her chest. She looked at the street for a moment. "Stephen," she said. "Mamie," he said, the same way he had said his own name that first day, like a decision. She turned her head and looked at him directly, and he was already looking at her, and the afternoon light on the porch of the hotel in Copper Falls in August of 1883 was warm and quiet and entirely unambiguous about what it was illuminating. "I intend to stay in Copper Falls," she said. "Good," he said. "Not because of the commission." "I know," he said. "I have been hoping that was the case." She looked at him steadily. "I am still grieving Thomas," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I think I will be grieving him for a long time. He was a good man and I loved him." Stephen nodded. No flinching, no looking away. "He sounds like he was," he said. "And I would never ask you not to." She studied him for a moment, this man who paid complete attention and did not offer platitudes and had listened to her for 45 minutes on the first day and taken everything she said seriously. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may have more than professional feelings for you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know I have more than professional feelings for you. I have been fairly certain of it since you told me the land was a text." She laughed, startled, and it was the first fully unguarded laugh she had laughed in months, maybe longer, and it sounded strange to her own ears for half a second before it sounded right. He leaned forward slightly and she did not move away, and then his hand was over hers on the arm of the chair, warm and careful, and the street in front of them went on being ordinary and the dog slept in its shade and the child ran back the other way. "I am not going to rush you," he said. "I am not asking you not to," she said. "I am asking you to be patient." "That I can do," he said. She turned her hand over so her palm was against his. They sat like that until the afternoon light shifted and the hotel proprietor came out to light the porch lamp. And then they went to dinner together, which was not the first time but felt like the first time, and they talked until the restaurant closed. The Aldridge trial in September was a 4-day event that drew more attention than Copper Falls had seen in years. A reporter from the Santa Fe newspaper came. A sketch artist from a paper in Denver came. Territorial court was convened in the largest building in town, which was the meeting hall next to the church, and people came from the surrounding ranches and settlements to watch. Mamie testified on the second day. She stood at the front of the meeting hall with the map, her original map, mounted on a board, and she explained it to the court the way she would have explained a survey to a client, clearly and precisely, walking the jury through each marked location and the methodology she had used to find it. She spoke for 3 hours with 2 short recesses, and the attorney called it one of the most compelling pieces of testimony he had ever witnessed. And the Denver sketch artist drew her standing at the map board, and the sketch ran in the paper the following week with the caption, "The surveyor who solved what the marshals could not." Mamie found the caption a little unfair to Stephen, who had taken everything she brought him and acted on it with complete trust and considerable strategic skill. She wrote a letter to the Denver paper saying so. They did not print it, but she felt better for having sent it. Cole Aldridge received 30 years in the territorial penitentiary. Dex Prout received life. The other 6 members of the gang received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Floyd Haggart received 7 years for conspiracy and providing material assistance to criminals. The territorial judge was not inclined toward leniency, and Mamie thought he was right. After the verdicts, Stephen found her outside the meeting hall in the early afternoon. He stood beside her in the street and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "It is done." "Yes," she said. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. "Like the ground has stopped moving," she said. "For 5 months I have been standing on something that was not stable, and now it is." He looked at her sidelong. "What are you going to do with stable ground?" "Build something," she said. There was a long pause. "Mamie," he said. "Stephen," she said. "I would like to ask you a question that is significantly more personal than anything I have asked you before." She looked at him. "Ask it." "Would you consider having dinner with me on Saturday, not as colleagues, not because there is case business to discuss, but because I am very much in love with you and I would like to say so properly over a meal?" She looked at him for a full 10 seconds, long enough that he began to look very slightly uncertain, which was the first time she had seen that expression on his face, and she found it endearing. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. "Good. I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time. I was waiting for the right moment to say it, and I think watching you orchestrate the arrest of 8 outlaws while trusting my map completely may have been that moment, if I am honest." He looked at her, surprised again, that same way he had looked at her in the office on the first day, like someone recalculating something fundamental. "You did not say anything for weeks," he said. "I was processing," she said. "I am very methodical." He laughed, and she laughed, and they were standing in the street in Copper Falls on a bright September day in 1883, and it was very ordinary and very remarkable at the same time. Saturday's dinner was at the best restaurant in Copper Falls, which was not a high bar but which had decent beef and excellent pie and a proprietress who was both discreet and warmly observant, and who set them at a corner table without being asked, and did not hover. Stephen wore a clean jacket and had taken some care with his appearance in a way that was subtle but noticeable to someone paying attention, which Mamie was. She had worn her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she had brought from Virginia and which she wore perhaps twice a year. They talked for 3 hours, not about work, about everything else. Books they had read, which turned out to be an extensive overlap since they were both readers who took books seriously. The question of whether New Mexico would achieve statehood and what that would mean for the territory, and for the people who had made their lives here, including the Pueblo and Navajo peoples whose land claims were being constantly eroded by the same kind of survey disputes Mamie was being paid to resolve, a reality she did not flinch from and which he did not either. Music, which it turned out she had opinions about, having grown up in a musical household. Politics carefully, because they were not always in agreement, and that turned out to be interesting rather than difficult. He walked her back to the hotel in the cool evening air. The stars were out, the same enormous blazing sky she had slept under on the way to the mine shafts, but different now, warmer, less vast somehow, though they had not changed. At the foot of the hotel steps he stopped, and she stopped, and he took her hand in both of his. "I would like to see you again," he said. "In this context specifically." "Sunday," she said. He smiled. "Sunday." She went up the steps and into the hotel, and she stood in the window of her room and watched the street for a minute after he had gone, feeling the peculiar and specific lightness of a person who has been carrying a great deal of weight for a very long time and has just been allowed to set a portion of it down. Not all of it. She was still grieving Thomas in the deep background, the way one grieves a person one genuinely loved, which is not loud or constant but surfaces in unexpected moments. A smell, a quality of light, a particular word. She thought Thomas would have had opinions about Stephen Barker, probably complicated ones, probably mixed with some protectiveness and some relief, and knowing Thomas, some genuine curiosity about the man. Thomas had been magnanimous in the way good people are, with room in his understanding for complexity. She wrote in her journal that night, the first time she had written in it since the arrests, and what she wrote was not about love or loss but about the land, about the way the Sangre de Cristo foothills had looked in the early morning light on the day the gang had arrived, the way the rock had gone from black to red to gold in the space of 30 minutes as the sun came up, and how the silver in the old mine shaft had caught the light from the entrance and glittered in the darkness like a thing that was both beautiful and terrible. She wrote about the feel of the transit under her hands and the satisfaction of a precise measurement and the specific way understanding a piece of terrain felt like reading a good sentence, the click of comprehension, the sense of a thing becoming clear. Then she wrote one more thing at the bottom of the page. I think I am going to be all right. They courted through the fall. It was a small-town courtship, which meant it was not exactly private, and Mamie had the experience of being watched with cheerful attention by most of the population of Copper Falls, as she and Stephen moved from dinner to Sunday walks, to occasional evenings at the home of Gus Hartley and his wife Clara, who had made it their business to include both Stephen and Mamie in their domestic life in a way that was generous and a little transparent and entirely welcome. Gus Hartley's wife was a formidable woman in her 40s who had raised 4 children in the New Mexico territory and had opinions about most things and expressed them without apology. She took to Mamie immediately, which Mamie suspected had something to do with Gus's account of the mine shaft operation, and she took to including Mamie in conversations about land and surveying and territory politics with the ease of someone who recognized a competent person and was glad to know one. It was Clara Hartley who told Stephen, apparently with complete directness, that he was going to lose Mamie Alden if he did not stop being subtle about his intentions. He came to the hotel on a Saturday in October with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she had not seen before, which was a combination of determination and the vulnerability she had glimpsed once or twice beneath his composure. "I need to talk to you," he said. She stepped out onto the porch. The October air was sharp, and the cottonwoods along the creek at the edge of town had gone yellow, and the sky was a particular deep blue that meant the cold was coming. He stood in front of her and looked at her directly. "I know we have not been doing this for very long," he said. "I know you are still grieving Thomas, and I know that grief does not follow any schedule I can set for it. I am not trying to rush you past anything, but I want you to know clearly and plainly what I intend." She waited. "I am in love with you," he said, "fully and entirely. Not because you helped me solve a case, though the way you did that still amazes me, and I think it will continue to amaze me for the rest of my life, but because of who you are. Because you told me the land was a text, and the mind you have that can say that and mean it is the most extraordinary thing I have encountered in 36 years. Because you are honest when honesty is difficult. Because you do not soften things to make other people comfortable, and you do it without being unkind. Because you make me want to be more precise in my own thinking." He stopped, took a breath. "I would like to marry you, Mamie, when you are ready, if you are ever ready, and if you are not, I would like to know that too, because I would rather know than not know." She looked at him for a long time. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. A horse clattered past on the street. The October sky was that deep, final, perfect blue. "I am ready," she said. He blinked. "You are?" "Yes." She paused. "I have been thinking about it for 6 weeks. I am methodical, as you know. I think about things thoroughly before I decide. I decided 3 weeks ago. I was waiting for you to ask." He stared at her for a second, and then he laughed, and then he stepped forward and took her face in his hands and kissed her, right there on the porch of the Copper Falls Hotel in broad October daylight, and she kissed him back, and the porch was warm from the afternoon sun, and his hands were careful and certain, and she felt something in herself open toward him like ground that has been waiting for water. They married in December of 1883, a small ceremony in the Copper Falls Church with Gus and Clara Hartley as witnesses and Pete Rawls, and Cord Faber in attendance, and the hotel proprietress crying quietly in the third pew. Mamie wore a cream-colored dress that Clara had helped her make, practical enough for the season and beautiful enough for the occasion. Stephen wore his good jacket and a tie that Clara had also been involved in selecting, which he had resisted and which was perfect. The minister was a gentle, soft-spoken man named Reverend Blaine, who had been in Copper Falls for 7 years and had seen the aftermath of the Aldridge raid, and who, when he got to the part of the ceremony about love bearing all things, looked at Mamie with an expression that was specific and warm, as if he understood exactly what those words meant to her. She said her vows clearly and steadily, looking at Stephen, who said his own vows with the same directness he brought to everything, looking at her without breaking. After the ceremony, there was dinner at the Hartley's house, which turned out to involve most of the town anyway because Clara Hartley had taken care of the invitations, and there was fiddle music and pie and the particular warmth of a community gathered around something good. Mamie danced with Stephen exactly once, because she did not consider herself an accomplished dancer, and she said so. He said he was not either, and they discovered this was true of both of them, and it was hilarious, and they stood at the edge of the room watching everyone else and talking and drinking cider and being, in the way that felt very new and very right, simply happy. They had taken a house on the south side of Copper Falls, a good-sized house for the territory, with a room she could use as a drafting room for her survey work, and a stable with enough room for their horses and a porch that faced west and caught the sunset. He had negotiated the house purchase with the kind of patient persistence she was coming to recognize as one of his fundamental qualities, and she had negotiated the interior arrangements with the kind of systematic reasoning he was coming to recognize as one of hers, and they had arrived at the result without a single significant disagreement, which seemed to them both like evidence of something. The work continued. Mamie's survey commission expanded through the winter and into the spring of 1884. The disputed land boundaries in the Copper Falls district turned out to be a significant and complex problem, involving overlapping claims from 3 different ranching operations, the mining company, and 2 Pueblo communities whose use rights predated almost every other claim and whose treatment by the territorial legal system Mamie found deeply unjust, and said so publicly, in her survey reports, in terms that were measured and documented and difficult to dismiss because they were precise. The territorial attorney general initially tried to minimize her report's findings regarding the Pueblo land use rights. Mamie corresponded with him directly, citing specific legal precedents, and then corresponded with the federal Indian agent for the territory, and then corresponded with a lawyer in Washington who had handled similar cases in other territories. She was methodical and she was patient, and she was relentless in the way that only people with genuine conviction can be. And by the end of 1884, the Pueblo community's historical boundaries had been formally acknowledged in the territorial survey records for the first time. Stephen watched this process with the admiration of a man who recognized a long campaign being run well, and he told her so, and she said, "I learned from the best methodology I know, which is surveying. You establish fixed points and you work outward from them. The fixed points being the law and the facts," he said. "The fixed points being what is right," she said. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for a year now, with that complete, thorough attention, and said, "Yes." She was pregnant by the spring of 1884, a fact that she discovered calmly and told him in the same calm way, because she had been expecting it was possible and had been paying attention to the signs. He received the news with the particular stillness of a man taking in something large, and then with a warmth that was so genuine and uncomplicated that it surprised her, because she had prepared herself for complicated reactions and he had not given her one. "Are you frightened?" she asked him, using his own question from the ridge above the mine shafts. "A little," he said, with the same honesty she had given then. "Are you?" "A great deal," she admitted, "but the useful kind of frightened." The baby was born in November of 1884, a boy, large and emphatic about his opinions from the first hour, and they named him James after her father. James Barker arrived in the world on a Thursday in the kind of fierce November windstorm that New Mexico specializes in, and the sound of the wind outside the window while Clara Hartley helped Mamie through the birth was something she would always associate with him afterward. That particular wild sound, which seemed right for a child born to two people who read the land and kept the law. Stephen had spent the duration of the birth in the kitchen with Gus Hartley, who had been through this 4 times and was the appropriate person for the purpose. When Clara came to the kitchen door and said it was done and they could come, Stephen moved through the house with a speed that was unlike his usual deliberateness, and stood at the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Mamie, pale and exhausted and entirely herself, holding a child that was red-faced and furious and alive. And the expression on his face was something she filed away very precisely in the part of her mind that kept the things she wanted to keep. James was a noisy baby who became a curious toddler who became a serious, attentive small boy who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's jawline, and who followed Mamie into the field when she would allow it, learning to observe terrain at an age when most children were learning to read. She taught him the names of rocks, the stories of erosion, the way a dry wash spoke of older water. He listened with the same thoroughness his father brought to everything, which made her privately certain that the capacity for thorough attention was a quality that could be inherited. By 1887, Stephen had been made chief marshal for the Copper Falls district, a promotion that came with more administrative work and less field work, which he found mixed, and which Mamie found gave him more evenings at home, which she did not find mixed at all. He was good at the administrative work because he was organized and principled, and the people under him trusted him, which was the fundamental requirement for the job. He was also the kind of man who made sure his deputies were well trained and fairly treated, which was not as common a quality as it should have been. The territory was changing. The railroad had come within 40 miles of Copper Falls, which changed the economics of everything. Silver mining continued to be significant, but cattle ranching was expanding, and the land disputes Mamie worked on became more numerous and more complex as the population grew and the pressure on the land increased. She took on an apprentice in 1886, a young man from Albuquerque named David Tate, who was quick and methodical, and who she trained with the same thoroughness her father had trained her, including the expectation that he would see why things were done and not simply do them. She and Stephen had a second child in 1888, a girl they named Ruth, who arrived with considerably less drama than James had but made up for it in personality within the first weeks. Ruth was sunny and fierce and interested in everything, and she grew up riding horses with a confidence that made her father quietly terrified and her mother quietly proud, because Mamie had been riding in this country for 7 years by then, and she knew what a rider looked like who understood the animal and what one looked like who was simply reckless, and Ruth was the former. The house on the south side of Copper Falls had been expanded twice by 1889, once for the drafting room and once for the children's rooms, and the porch that faced west was the center of their evenings when the weather allowed, the place where they sat in the declining light and talked the way they had been talking since that first night in the marshal's office when she had unrolled a map and changed both their lives. They talked about everything. They disagreed about things. They were, as individuals, not particularly inclined toward easy agreement, both of them being people who had opinions and who had arrived at those opinions through thought, and so disagreements happened and were conducted with directness and without cruelty, and were generally resolved, though not always, because some things were not resolvable and did not need to be. What they did not disagree about was the important things. Justice and honesty and the obligation of competence, the idea that if you could do a thing well you had a responsibility to do it, and to do it fully. The land and what it deserved from the people who lived on it. their children, and how to raise them. The value of paying complete attention to the person in front of you. In 1890, Stephen came home one evening with a letter from the territorial government. He set it on the dinner table and she read it and looked at him. "It is quite an honor," she said carefully. "It is," he agreed. The letter was an offer of appointment as territorial marshal for all of New Mexico, which would require moving to Santa Fe. She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know what you think," he said. "Stephen." "I mean it," he said. "This is not my decision alone. Your work is here. The commission is here. The Pueblo boundary cases that are still in process." "Mission can transfer," she said. "David can hold the work here. The Pueblo cases are close enough to resolution that I can transition them." She paused. "The question is not whether I can do it. The question is whether it is right for you." He looked at her steadily. "It would mean more work in the service of something I care about, more reach, more ability to do the things I think matter." "Then yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He was quiet for a second. "You are sure?" "I am methodical," she said. "When I say yes, I have thought it through." He smiled, and it was the same smile from the first time, slow and genuine and entirely his. They moved to Santa Fe in the spring of 1891. The city was larger and noisier than Copper Falls, and the children found it fascinating and overwhelming in roughly equal measure. James, who was 6, immediately began studying the city the way his mother had taught him to study terrain, observing and recording and drawing maps of the streets in his notebook. Ruth, who was 2.5, found the market plaza the most interesting place she had ever been and made this known emphatically. Mamie's work expanded in Santa Fe. The territorial capital had more complex land cases and more need for precise survey work, and she was already known there from the Aldridge case and from the Pueblo boundary work, so the transition was smoother than she had feared. She took on a larger commission and a second apprentice and rented a separate office building for the first time, which felt like a declaration of something. She also became involved, carefully and deliberately, in the ongoing discussions about land rights for the indigenous communities throughout the territory. It was work that paid nothing and cost her political goodwill with certain powerful people, and she did it anyway, because the land was a text and she could read what had happened to it, and what had happened to it was not acceptable, and she had never been someone who found the unacceptable acceptable simply because it was convenient. Stephen supported this work. Not passively, not just tolerating it, but actively, using his position to ensure that survey findings regarding indigenous land use were properly submitted to the federal government and not buried in territorial bureaucratic filing systems. There were people who were unhappy about this. He managed their unhappiness with the patient, principled steadiness that had always been his fundamental quality, and he did not change course. In 1893, Mamie published a monograph through the territorial government press about survey methodology as applied to historical land use documentation. It was a technical document, not intended for a general audience, but it circulated among the professional surveying community and eventually among legal scholars, and it was cited in 3 federal court cases before the end of the decade. She wrote it at the drafting table in her Santa Fe office over 6 months, after the children were in bed and before Stephen was up in the mornings, in the particular quiet that she had always found most conducive to precise thinking. When it was published, he bought her dinner at the best restaurant in Santa Fe, just the 2 of them. The children left with a trusted household helper for the evening, and he held up his glass and looked at her and said, "To the clearest mind I have ever known." She held up her own glass and looked back at him and thought about the 12 years that had passed since she had walked into a marshal's office in Copper Falls and unrolled a map on his desk, and the woman she had been then, compressed and purposeful and carrying grief like a surveyor carries equipment, essential and heavy. And the woman she was now, still purposeful, still precise, still the person who read the land and would read it until she could not ride anymore, but also this other thing, this person who had been loved well and had loved well in return, who had built something real in a real place with a real man, who had raised 2 children to look at the world with curiosity and care. "To the most patient man I have ever known," she said in return. He laughed. "You make patience sound almost like a virtue." "It is a virtue," she said. "I was always quite certain of it, even the first day in my office. Especially then," she said, "you did not interrupt me once. In 40 minutes of testimony about surveying methodology and outlaw tracking and mine shaft ventilation patterns, you did not interrupt me once. I noticed." He looked at her with that same attention, undiminished by 12 years and 2 children, and a career that had taken them from Copper Falls to Santa Fe, the same quality of listening that had been the first thing about him she had truly seen. "I was afraid to interrupt," he said honestly. "I was afraid if I said anything you would stop talking, and I was not ready for that." She smiled. It was a full, unhidden thing, the kind of smile she had gradually learned to let be visible. "You are a good man, Stephen Barker," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. "Your father." "You," he said simply. She set down her glass and looked at him for a long moment across the candle-lit table, and the years arranged themselves behind her like a survey line from a fixed point, each one measured and placed, each one part of the picture that the land of their life together made. There had been betrayal in the story, Floyd Haggert's hidden motive, Cole Aldridge's ruthlessness, the forced choice of whether to trust a widow's map over the entire intelligence apparatus of a marshal's office. There had been dark pasts and secrets, and the ultimate sacrifice Thomas Alden had made without choosing it. There had been the forbidden complexity of loving again after loss, the trap of thinking the past defined the future. But there had also been this man across the table, this life, this work, this territory of red rock and enormous sky that she had learned to read like a text and had never stopped reading. These children who would grow up knowing how to look at the world precisely and honestly. This house in Santa Fe, where the desert air came through the windows in the morning, and the light on the mountains changed all day, and the porch faced west and caught the evening. The land was a text. She had always believed that. And her life was a text too, she thought. One she had helped write in the years before Stephen and in the years with him, and it was legible from where she sat, all its surveyed lines clear, its elevations measured, its distances known. It was a good land. She picked up her glass again and finished the toast they had started, and he finished his, and they ordered the second course, and talked about James's latest school report and Ruth's increasingly bold opinions about horse breeds, and whether the new surveying equipment from back east would be better than what she currently used, and what he thought about the developments in the eastern part of the territory that were likely to require significant legal attention in the next year. They talked until the restaurant was closing and the candles were burning low, and then they walked home in the Santa Fe night under the same enormous stars that had hung over a cold desert ridge 9 years ago, when 2 people had sat in the dark watching an outlaw's mine shaft and had been, without quite knowing it, at the beginning of something. Mamie Alden Barker walked beside her husband through the dark streets of Santa Fe and felt the solid ground under her feet, the ground she had read and mapped and measured, the ground that held the history of a place and the footprints of a life. And she thought, as she had written in her journal years ago in a hotel room in Copper Falls, "I am going to be all right, more than all right." She was exactly where she had surveyed herself into being, on ground she had chosen, under a sky she had learned, beside a man who had listened to every word she had ever said and taken each one seriously. Fixed points, she thought. You establish them and you work outward. The stars were very bright. The night was very still. Stephen's hand found hers in the dark, easy and certain, the way things are when they have been true for a long time. And Mamie Alden, who had once set out alone into the desert with her grief and her instruments and her refusal to leave a wrong uncorrected, who had read the land until it told her where the hidden things were kept, held that hand and walked home through the Santa Fe night, and she was not alone, and the trail was not cold, And the map she had made had led her somewhere she had not known she was looking for and could not now imagine being without.